Limiting freedom of speech is a very basic move in the playbook of any autocracies. But Vladimir Putin has taken his hatred towards free media to yet another level. With independent journalists silenced, exiled, and imprisoned, and foreign correspondents permanently under threat of arrest, Russia has effectively become a news desert. So why is the Kremlin so afraid of the written and spoken word? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. Being a journalist in Russia has never been an easy task. Widespread corruption, lack of transparency in public institutions, hostile politicians. All these factors made the lives of Russian reporters difficult. But under the rule of Vladimir Putin, difficult has evolved into impossible. Following Moscow's attack on Ukraine, most of the leading names in Russian journalism have fled the country, taking refuge abroad. Why is the regime so confrontational towards them? And how can they continue to report on Russia without actually being in Russia? In a moment, we'll talk about this with a panel of experts, but first, let's hear about the long-standing war between the Kremlin and independent media.
Over the last 2 decades, freedom of speech in Russia has been severely limited. As the country has progressed towards autocracy, it's become increasingly harder to obtain information and investigate wrongdoings by public officials. Perhaps the most dramatic episode in this tense relationship occurred on October 7, 2006, when Anna Politkovskaya, a leading voice of Russian independent journalism, was found dead outside her apartment in Moscow's city center. Politkovskaya, a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin and an avid defender of human rights and freedom of expression, was shot at close range. For many, her murder was a message from the Kremlin, addressed to the entire journalistic community: stay out of our business, or you'll suffer the consequences. Since then, things have taken a turn for the worse. Russia began to threaten and imprison those who actively sought the truth and dared to report it. Leading independent outlets, including Meduza and Holod, have relocated to other countries and are now reporting on Russian affairs from abroad. But that's not to say that the country has eliminated its media altogether. On the contrary, Moscow has been investing heavily into propaganda outlets. 2005 saw the launch of Russia Today, a state-owned and sponsored TV news channel aimed at disseminating propaganda internationally. It soon evolved into an entire ecosystem of global reach, broadcasting in English, Spanish, German, and even Arabic. The channel's editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonian, has always been frank about the very purpose Russia Today was established. It's waging an information war with the entire Western world, she said, claiming the network to be as important as Russia's defense ministry in ensuring the security of the Russian people. Following the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the European Union banned Russia Today from broadcasting on its territory, together with other propaganda outlets such as news website Sputnik. But elsewhere in the world, the voice of the Kremlin is still heard loud and clear, because in Putin's war on the media, the whole world is a battlefield.
As we have just seen, the relationship between Vladimir Putin's Russia and independent media has always been tense. To explore and discuss this issue further, we have 3 esteemed guests with us tonight. Yelena Kostyuchenko, independent Russian writer and journalist. Jason Stanley, professor of philosophy, University of Yale. And Ben Dubow, senior fellow at Center for European Policy Analysis. Good evening. I want to begin with you, Elena, and ask you about your personal experience, because you have a decades-long track record of reporting on Russia, including Russia under the rule of Vladimir Putin. And looking at the situation right now, how do you, or how does one, report on Russia when it has become effectively a country with no freedom of speech whatsoever?
It's extremely hard. I'm a reporter, so I basically write about what I see and hear. And me, as many of my colleagues, are living in exile right now. We cannot come back to Russia, or we will be imprisoned. So, me personally, I'm concentrated on the places Russia affects, like Ukraine mostly. But some of my colleagues, I keep reporting from outside. They're using async technology, open source intelligence, and they rely on their sources. But we wouldn't be able to proceed without journalists who are staying in Russia right now and basically risking their freedom and often their life to keep doing their work. Amongst them is my younger sister who lives in Moscow and who's an investigative reporter, and I'm extremely proud of her and also extremely scared of her.
And in your daily work, when you're trying to dissect what's true and what's part of the Kremlin propaganda operations, how difficult is it for you to come across with your voice and to make your true, authentic, independent journalistic voice heard and to separate yourself from the Russian propaganda? How do you come across to the Western public especially?
Well, it's also challenging. Our propaganda is very sophisticated and, as you know, extremely well-founded. They spent on propaganda around $2 billion just for the last 2 years. It's a lot. They also block all independent media from reaching our audience. They have in Russia a special censorship agency called Roskomnadzor, which is kind of create all the efforts from the state on the censorship. So our main issue is right now to reach the audience. More than 1 million their pages were blocked since the beginning of war in Ukraine. Amongst them, as you said, almost all independent media. So far we use VPN technology and YouTube and Telegram, which are not blocked yet in Russia. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are already blocked. And about verifying the information, I believe nothing has been changed for last years. I mean, you check your sources carefully and you try to find eyewitnesses as many as possible.
We'll talk about the ways to circumvent Russian propaganda, but I want to move to Professor Stanley now, because you're an expert on propaganda in various non-democratic regimes, not just the Russian one. And I wanted to ask you, quite frankly, why is it so important to any autocratic leader, including Vladimir Putin, to keep control over the news ecosystem and to silence journalists?
Well, there's just old points that if you eliminate the reliable media, the heroic journalists, then you can have one perspective that you broadcast. Nazis did that, right? And we're seeing an information space very much like that in contemporary Russia, just one single message. Before this point, before the point of mobilizing people with one single message, you had of the information space, kind of like what Elon Musk is doing with Twitter, simply too many messages to make sense of reality. But an autocrat needs to destroy a democratic information space, because an autocrat, the whole point of autocracy is the autocrat tells you what reality is.
And finally, I want to get Ben involved in that conversation. Since you're a practitioner, you're a researcher, can you tell us or lay down the pillars and foundations of the Russian propaganda, also based on some case studies perhaps that you encounter in your daily work? And my underlying question to you would be, is it really that sophisticated? Is it really that efficient as we're very often told in the Western countries?
Yeah, so there are really three pillars of international propaganda emanating from Russia. The first and most obvious, though often overlooked, is just Russian language, media generally. The Russian government owns almost all studios, distribution networks. The ones that aren't owned by the Russian government are generally owned by oligarchs who are very close to the Kremlin. So a lot of this is fairly benign, reality shows, game shows, etc. But it does a very effective job of continuing to bind Russian speakers throughout the former Soviet Union to Russia. That's really where Russia aims to exert most of its influence. The second pillar is international propaganda, overt propaganda, targeting international audiences. This is mostly RT and Sputnik, but includes a few smaller outlets as well. Throughout the early 2010s, because of some various contingencies within the Russian information environment, this proved incredibly effective. They seemed to intuit how to take advantage of recommendation engines much earlier than anyone else had. Because of that, RT was the most watched news network on YouTube, #1 news channel in English, in Arabic, top 5 in Spanish, French, and German. RT had the most followed Twitter account on Twitter in Spanish. And so that was very effective throughout the early through mid 2010s.
I'm gonna stop you right there, and I'm gonna ask you, if I may, to elaborate on that a little bit, because we're gonna talk about Russia today specifically in the second part of the show. But I wanted to ask you: is this really one coherent outlet broadcasting the same message globally, or is there a narrative difference? If you could elaborate between, for instance, RT in Arabic and RT in French, and any other permutation of that.
Yeah, so one of the things that have made these outlets very effective is they're very good at catering their messages to different audiences. And this varies from language to language. You know, a lot of what they do is in taking Russian experts on and promoting the Russian worldview. They find people within the United States who are very far on the left, very far on the right, give them a platform and try to promote this idea of, you know, the West is betraying the world. They find, you know, Islamists within the Arabic world to do that. They find, you know, people who are very in tune to the specific context so that their messaging really resonates with the audiences as opposed to all of the messages coming from Moscow itself.
Thank you very much for your insights. We'll explore them further in the second part of our show when we examine the equally tense relationship between the Kremlin and international media. Although some leading international outlets still have correspondents in Russia, their opportunities to report the reality on the ground are severely restricted. Iwan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal correspondent, has spent over a year in unlawful detention, arrested under charges of committing espionage on behalf of the United States. Recently, in April, Russian authorities denied 2 other reporters known for working with foreign media outlets. Let's hear more about the reality of being an international correspondent in today's Russia in this report.
On March 29th last year, Iwan Gershkovich, an American reporter working for the Wall Street Journal, was detained by Russian authorities and charged with violating the country's security laws. He is the first American reporter arrested on Russian soil since the end of the Cold War. A few months later, in October 2023, authorities moved to detain Alsu Kurmasheva, a journalist working with Radio Free Europe. Most recently, in April of this year, 2 other names joined the growing list of imprisoned journalists. Konstantin Gabov, who has a history of working with Reuters, and Sergei Karelin, a writer for the news agency Associated Press, were detained on charges of extremism and connections with so-called undesired agents, including the foundation run by the late Alexei Navalny. Many leading media outlets from Europe and the US, including the BBC, France 24, Euronews, and the New York Times, have been made inaccessible in Russia, without an announcement of any legal, administrative, or judicial decision. Roskomnadzor, the omnipotent media regulator, is issuing arbitrary bans blocking reporters from accessing public information and censoring their work. According to the World Press Freedom Index, an annual assessment of the state of free speech prepared by Reporters Without Borders, as many as 32 reporters and media workers are currently imprisoned in Russia. This puts the country behind only China, Myanmar, Belarus, Israel, and Vietnam. Those who still fight for their rights as journalists are facing not only physical threats, but also economic pressure. Many print outlets have government-imposed limits on their circulation and are allowed to print and sell only 999 copies of each edition. With advertising revenue drying up, severe restrictions on internet access and permanent fear of persecution, the prospects of media freedom in Russia are becoming darker by the day. And the return of international correspondence, once a very vibrant group, appears almost impossible.
On the basis of what we've just heard and our previous discussion, I want to begin with Ben again and ask you specifically about Russia today and its role in the propaganda ecosystem of the Kremlin, because this is critically and very often assessed to be an offensive propaganda weapon. But is it really as powerful as we often think? Is it that efficient that's able to topple entire governments?
So throughout the early to mid 2010s, RT was certainly one of the most powerful media sources online. Others have caught up with it. The EU banning it on its soil really kind of pushed its ability to change people's views to reach its audience to the margins throughout the 2020s. But it still is widely consumed throughout the Arab world, throughout Francophone Africa. And it does have an impact. I wouldn't say it's ever responsible for toppling a government by itself, but it certainly can give a platform to those who seek to topple a government, provide them support, and help to mobilize their base.
And do you think there is an efficient way, any way for that matter, that the West could put forward to counter Russia Today's propaganda? Can we even attempt to fight it, or is this just something that we have to accept in our news ecosystem as well?
I personally believe the best way to attack false speech is with more free speech, more support for journalists around the world and within the United States, but especially Spanish-speaking media, Arabic-speaking media goes a long way to give people alternative sources for journalists to be able to experiment and to tear away that audience that RT is now capturing.
Well, on that note, especially speaking about support to independent journalists, I want to move back to you, Elena, and ask you about your current perspective and your current challenges in reporting on Russia, because you're also writing, especially right now, I believe, for international audience. Has your work become different, perhaps more difficult since the full-scale invasion into Ukraine? And do you think that you need to tailor your voice anyhow differently when you're speaking about Russia to an international audience?
I still rely on Russian audience mostly because those are my people and I want to inform them. I cannot report myself from Russia as many of my colleagues, but I can support people who are currently reporting from Russia. Most of them are anonymous. Most of them are being searched by authorities. And some of them have to move from one city to another city, so living basically kind of spy life. But they are willing their voices being heard here on the West. And I believe this is my goal, to make them heard. Not just in Russia, but here on the West too. Because it really pains me when Western media starts to quote Russia Today as a reliable source, or saying that 87% of Russians voted for Putin, or something like that. It's awful.
And do you feel like this is still happening very often, that we here, broadly speaking, in the West fall into the narrative, the propaganda traps of the Kremlin, even if we don't want to?
It does. It does. This propaganda is very efficient, and you didn't mention also like troll fabric. This is a very specific structure. There are like some government employees are pretending to be regular people or witnesses or whatever, and they just spread the narratives in social media. And many Western journalists got caught in these false narratives, unfortunately. It is efficient, but I also believe that what we can provide as an answer is like more honest, more decent, more free journalism. So we just basically have to keep working.
I think Professor Stanley here is eager to join the conversation. I actually have a question to you on a kind of more theoretical level. Why is Vladimir Putin so fixated on running this very complex and sophisticated international, and I stress the word international, propaganda machine? Why is this so important to him to broadcast his point of view, not just domestically, but also globally?
First of all, I have to say I reject the whole premise of this discussion. I think Fox News is obviously a more powerful propaganda arm than Vladimir Putin. And I don't see Americans as little passive chickens absorbing Kremlin propaganda. I mean, the attack on LGBT citizens, which is central to what we're seeing worldwide, that comes from the United States. This idea that we need, that our information, that we're like helpless, innocent people in the United States that need Russian propaganda to tell us that, to support Trump. Trump's a very American character. We don't need Russian propaganda to spread hate messages about LGBT citizens. We have that in the United States. So I know in Eastern Europe, it's commonly held that the United States is pure and innocent, and Russia, all bad
Not
things
anymore,
come from Russia.
I think, if I can interrupt. I think that perspective is actually changing. But since you kind of brought this up on us in this discussion, let's move to this elephant in the room and ask a very straightforward question to you. Is there a risk, a real risk, that Russian propaganda operations will be targeting the American audience ahead of the November elections and could interfere, and Russians could interfere in the vote to a comparable degree as they did in 2016?
I don't think Russian propaganda to interfere in our elections. And even if Russia didn't exist, I think roughly the same thing could happen. I think Russia could interfere in things like destabilizing states to create more immigration. I think that Russian propaganda mostly speaks to Russians, and that's why Elena, I think, is the most, I would put Elena as maybe the most important journalist for the Russian space. But, the Russian messages, what you think comes from Russia, also comes from the United States. We don't need Vladimir Putin to tell us those things.
Ben, if you could add your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. Really, what Russian media can do is, to some extent, accelerate trends that already exist in the countries where they're targeted. Russia will launch significant propaganda efforts, but it's ultimately going to be the domestic media environment that determines election outcomes, domestic media within the media environment that really makes the biggest difference in election results. I think that's true for almost every country.
And very quickly, from a regulatory perspective, do you think that measures like banning Russia today, for instance, as the European Union did from broadcasting on its soil, work in a longer time perspective, or is this just a futile operation?
It depends what you mean by work. Obviously, Russia doesn't have that platform anymore. Across social media engagements, RT gets far fewer engagements. In terms of support for Russia in the war, let's say, kind of one of the strongest metrics of whether Russian information operations are succeeding. I don't know how much of a difference banning RT has really made. It really does depend on your definition of work. RT definitely has kind of enjoyed playing the role of victim and showing that, the West's supposed commitment to free speech is hypocritical with their ban.
Elena Kostyuchenko, Ben Dubow, Jason Stanley, thank you very much. We will certainly be keeping an eye on the war on words that Kremlin is waging against free media. As we have seen and heard, freedom of speech is permanently under fire in Russia. But there is a positive conclusion to be drawn from this, that words matter, especially under autocratic leadership. They are still the most powerful tool at our disposal, so let's use them, hoping they will bring about the change so much needed in today's world. That's it for today's edition of The Wider View. Next week, we will explore the challenges ahead for European Union enlargement. Have a good evening.